So I'm pleased today to be speaking with Professor Carole Cusack from the University of Sydney. And Professor Cusack spoke at the Inform seminar on health and healing on the topic of Gurdjieff's teachings around healing and health, focusing on such things as diet, drugs and exercise practices that he advocated. This is also going to be the focus of a chapter in the forthcoming Routledge Inform volume on the topic of health and healing in minority religions. So welcome, Professor Cusack.
Thanks very much.
Hi. Could you just say a little bit about who you are and what your current research interests are?
Well, I'm Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Sydney in Australia. And I work mostly in the field of new religions and new spiritualities and contemporary religious trends, though I have other interests kind of outside of that. And the study of George Ivanovitch Gurdjieff's taken up a lot of my time for probably a bit more than a decade. And I'm still working on a number of projects associated with Gurdjieff. So I was very pleased to have the opportunity to write up that chapter for the Inform volume.
That's great. So could you just tell us, in a nutshell, the basis of Gurdjieff's teachings around health and healing?
Well, Gurdjieff's teachings are extremely complicated and they're not that well known. So, for example, somebody like Rudolf Steiner, who, even though he died much younger, was born at around about the same time and had some of the same concerns, is much, much better known, largely because of the Steiner-Waldorf education system. There is an official body representing Gurdjieff's teachings, the Gurdjieff Foundation, or the Institute Gurdjieff, as the Paris branch is called. But in general, the number of people involved in the work, as Gurdjieff's teaching is generally known, it's also sometimes called the Fourth Way, is not really that large. On health and healing, what I did in my chapter was to try to put it under 4 different headers. And the first was about Gurdjieff himself and how he had like healing powers and was able to cure illnesses and to perform, essentially quite miraculous operations in other people's lives around their well-being. The second was the sacred dances, and you mentioned exercise, and this is the principal kind of formal exercise that's done in the work, and these dances are I suppose, in some sense, equivalent to eurythmy, which is done in the Steiner tradition, and again is better known. They were involved, however, not just in making you fitter or more coordinated, but they had a kind of metaphysical application as well. The third thing I discussed was everyday life practices like physical labour and what you ate, and how you cooked and prepared things, childcare, daily kind of practices. And the fourth was, you mentioned drugs, and there is one particular sort of period in Gurdjieff's life where he clearly used various types of drugs to stimulate one of the groups of pupils he had in terms of their spiritual progression. There's also a thing called inner exercises, which are kind of contemplative exercises. And when I spoke at Inform, I mentioned them very briefly, but when I wrote up my chapter, I realised they didn't really fit in quite the same way because they didn't really have a physiological aspect. They were entirely metaphysical. So I ended up leaving them out of the discussion. But arguably, you could say something about that too.
Right. So these practices that you've just discussed, what was the general purpose of them? Were they for specific healing, specific ailments, or was it for general health and well-being, or was it something more of a religious worldview? What was the purpose of them?
I think a lot of Gurdjieffians don't think of themselves as religious, but there's a sense in which you could argue the purpose was religious. Gurdjieff himself taught that, unlike, say the Orthodox Christianity that he was brought up in, he said human beings didn't have souls, they didn't have an immortal part. And they could only acquire that by cultivating a kind of consciousness which would lift them away from matter and the kind of deadness of the material universe and towards a kind of spiritual ideal. So he thought that there were four different states of consciousness, and most people never got beyond the first two, which was actually being asleep and the kind of waking life that the average non-spiritually engaged person is involved with, which he called waking sleep. He said, you know nothing happens, you perceive nothing, you're on the way to becoming kind of detritus of the universe when you die. And the idea is that all your energies get released into the universe, and all the growing and spiritually advancing organisms kind of gobble them up. And mostly it's the moon, allegedly, that eats all the people without souls. But the third state of consciousness was what Gurdjieff called self-remembering. And this is a state of consciousness that involves being able to divide, in a sense, so that you are aware of yourself, but you can also see the activity that you are engaged in, so you can observe yourself. And this lifts the level of consciousness and enables you to begin developing like an astral body. And finally, there's a condition he calls objective consciousness, by which you've achieved what he called a real I. And that's kind of an interesting question too, because he didn't think that people really had an identity. They were kind of just a bunch of fragments. But when you got a real I, he told one of his pupils, behind real I lies God, which suggests that when you've got a real I, you have like a divine spark you're going to live on after death. And it's quite similar to an orthodox theological idea called theosis, which suggests that as through spiritual exercises you ascend and you come closer and closer to God himself.
Well, that actually just touched on another question that I have, because we're interested in how these techniques around health and healing actually make a comment on or practices for immortality or life extension. So could you say a little bit more about that idea?
Yes. We have kind of an interesting collection of records about Gurdjieff. Initially, of course, maybe in the 1960s, or if someone was doing work then, they would have thought that there wasn't very much to go on, just his posthumous publications and P.D. Ouspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous. But in the last 20 years since the turn of the millennium, people have published lectures, memoirs, all sorts of things. And so we can go through a lot of material and we can ask questions about that. When Gurdjieff first set up in Paris in 1922, towards the end of 1922, there were journalists at his institute all the time, and they wanted to observe what these strange people who wore weird clothes and, did all sorts of odd things were doing. And there are reports in the French newspapers, and indeed English language newspapers too, that people were talking about living till 200 or perhaps, even longer. And certainly there was a sense that Gurdjieff, some of his followers thought that he couldn't die, and it was a great shock to them when he did in fact die in 1949. And in terms of extension of lifespan, you can't really make many claims from anecdotal evidence, but certainly a number of the first generation pupils Gurdjieff have lived to extraordinarily advanced ages. His immediate successor, whom he nominated, Jean de Salzmann, died at 101. Some of his other close acquaintance from his first generation of pupils died in their 90s. So these people continued, with their intellectual powers undimmed for very, very long lives. And I don't know what you can actually conclude about that. It might be happenstance, but it might have a lot to do with eating a particular kind of diet and doing an awful lot of movements as exercise meditating and contemplating and all the other things that come with the package.
So was it a particularly healthy diet that the followers consumed?
Probably modern people wouldn't, well, we'd be divided. He was no vegetarian, for example.
Right.
He actually thought, having been brought up with a father who at some point was a pastoralist, he thought everybody should learn how to raise animals and slaughter them and know what you were eating. But he was very interested in everyone eating things that were fresh. The institute in Paris, the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, it was called, they grew all their own vegetables and they picked them. One of his pupils, Olga de Hartmann, says in her memoir that he really didn't like things like peeling a potato. You should cook in the skins because there was goodness in there. And they made their own bread. So I guess one of the banes of modern life, processed food and sugars, were not really part of the diet. So it was very healthy from that point of view. But he was a great advocate of alcohol, which of course a lot of people nowadays would think wasn't particularly healthy.
Right.
But I think it's very clear from some of the memoirs, chiefly John and Elizabeth Bennet's memoir called Idiots in Paris, which is about the 40s, that the alcohol was a kind of disinhibitor for certain sorts of breakthroughs, perhaps in the way that the drugs were as well.
Mm. Did Gurdjieff make any comments on where illness came from?
Not in the sense of, if you're thinking of, say, a kind of theodicy about explaining the origins of evil or anything like that. That is surprisingly absent from his teachings. And even though he did actually go to church at the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Paris, and that's where his funeral was held, Joseph Aziz, an Australian scholar who's done some amazing work on the contemplative exercises, has pointed out that he's interested in some bits of Christianity but not others. And so the bits of Christianity that he's not much interested in are Jesus, sin, redemption, soteriology. He just kind of drops all of that.
Right. So would you consider Gurdjieff as a religious figure? Is there a religious worldview around him and his followers?
Look, I think this is a great question. Nowadays, almost the two most obvious terms that are used to describe him are spiritual teacher, which Johanna Pesce, I think, was the first person really to push that and say it was better than, any of the others, and esotericist, or perhaps sometimes Western esotericist, though it's pretty obvious that some of his inspirations were Eastern rather than not Western. But when he was alive, nobody spoke of him in religious or spiritual terms. In fact, the most common epithets that journalists applied were things like magician and charlatan. He presented his teaching differently at different times of his career. And John Godolphin Bennett, who's probably the most adventurous and rather maverick of his continuators, one of his pupils who went on to lead a major branch of the Fourth Way tradition, he records that on occasion Gurdjieff did say he was Christ, or he was like an avatar, descending God in Hinduism. So I think there was religion there if you wanted it. One of his very early pupils, who was a very important movements pianist and teacher, Solange Clausts, said Gurdjieff isn't for or against religion. You could have had another religion and done the Gurdjieff exercises and it wouldn't have been a problem. But if you wanted to find religious meaning in them, it wasn't a problem either.
Right.
I think for most people it just wasn't raised.
I see. Do you know, are there many contemporary followers of Gurdjieff who perhaps follow those teachings who came after him? Are there communities around his teachings today?
Yes, definitely. When he died, he nominated a woman called Jeanne de Salzmann, who had been one of his pupils since, I think, 1919, so 30 years. He died in 1949. Madame de Salzmann established the Foundation Gurdjieff, Fondation Gurdjieff, Institute Gurdjieff, and it's got a couple of locations. There were 4, actually: London, Paris, New York, and Caracas. And that's a strange location, but it's partly because Madame de Salzmann's daughter moved there.
Right.
And there were always quite a lot of work people in South America. But in the 50s, there were people who decided that they didn't really want to go down her path and didn't like her formalization of structure, and they began non-foundation lineages. And many of them have turned out to be very interesting. So Bennett, for example, broke with Madame de Salzmann in 1953 and established a couple of communities in the UK. And when he died in 1974, he was primarily based at a place called Claymont Court in Virginia, in America. Francis Rolls in London set up an organisation called the Study Society. It still exists, and it still teaches the movements. They have a beautiful building in London, in Collette Gardens, and a couple of other groups broke off as well that were broadly Gurdjieffian. Some of them stopped. So the School of Economic Sciences were kind of a Gurdjieff group at the beginning, and then in the 60s, Leon McLaren, who led that group, discovered Advaita Vedanta and moved the whole thing in a much more kind of Hindu-derived direction. In America, there were many, many pupils who began independent teaching lineages. In the 70s, I think there was some real tension between the foundation and non-foundation people. But gradually, as the first generation died and numbers actually really have dwindled, the work has never been a big organisation, and nowadays it's pretty small, really. And most of the people who are involved are actually unorthodox or heterodox, not members of the foundation. So there are now these collaborative, kind of wonderful events. There's a thing called the All and Everything Conference, which is named for Gurdjieff's 3 books, All and Everything. And it's actually beginning its conference, first virtual conference, because of our special situation, on the 14th. So just in a couple of days this week, and I'm looking forward very much to attending that. And that's what's called a conference for the companions of the book. And the book they're referring to is Gurdjieff's book, Beelzebub's Tales, to his grandson. And at the conference, people read and interpret and give papers around all of the ideas that are contained in the book. But it's a very varied event, and there are people who are straight down the line foundation people, and there are people who are fringe Gurdjieff people, and there are people who are very fringe Gurdjieff people, and there are people like me who actually isn't a Gurdjieff person at all. I'm just a scholar who is interested in Gurdjieff and has made a lot of really good friends in the community and like to meet up with them and go along and hear what people are thinking about.
That sounds fascinating. So you mentioned there that it's something of a literary event in some ways, but do people still follow these techniques for health and healing? And do you think they've changed in any way over time?
Well, some things died with Gurdjieff. His own personal capacity to heal, to take... one of the things that he was supposed to do, which is reported in a number of different cases in pupil memoirs, is that when Thomas de Hartmann was suffering from typhus, I think, when they were in the Caucasus just after they'd left Russia during the revolution, he claimed that Gurdjieff's touch on his forehead took the fever from him. And when he was recovering, every time he saw his teacher, he would ask him to touch his forehead because he felt the illness sort of being taken away from him. Another pupil who was a child living at the foundation in Paris, who's called Fritz Peters, he claims that Gurdjieff similarly cured a leg that had a wound, his leg that had a hideous infected wound that, you know, could well have proved fatal. Gurdjieff himself claims that he managed to keep his wife alive for 2 years by taking onto himself the symptoms of her cancer, so that it didn't advance so much. But that sort of thing, no, I don't think anybody's ever told me that a contemporary Gurdjieff teacher or group leader can heal. So I think that's gone. The drugs and the hormones that he gave to the literary lesbians, the group called the Women of the Rope, in 1936 and 1937, again, I'd be very surprised if anything like that happened, because basically it was just astonishingly unregulated even at the time. We don't know where he got the drugs or the hormones from. The women in question didn't even know what he injected into them. They believed in him, and so it was okay. With regard to diet and raising livestock and growing your own vegetables and stuff, all of the work groups have often had large farming properties where some people lived permanently, but others came in for retreats and for events. So the late Annie Lou Stavely headed a community called Two Rivers in Oregon in America, which was a kind of major residential estate. All of Gurdjieff's immediate pupils, like Uspensky and Bennett, had these big estates where people grew fruit and veg and lived and worked and repaired the houses and built sheds and did all the hard physical labour that he advocated. Movements are another interesting one. Some groups do them and some groups don't. The Bennett lineage, again, has been probably the best in preserving knowledge of the movements. And in the last 20-odd years, there's been some really good scholarship, some from within Gurdjieff movement and some by people who've been interested but are from fundamentally outside. Certainly the conference, I attended the All and Everything conference at Kendal last year in 2019. The food was very wholesome and healthy and good and plentiful, and there was a great deal of celebratory drinking, which Gurdjieff would have appreciated very, very much.
That's great. So have we got any future publications on Gurdjieff to look forward to from yourself?
So many that it's a little bit hard to even kind of get them all in order. One that I think will appear this year is a edited volume that Steve Sutcliffe and I are doing with Brill, which is a collection. It's a reprint collection, but of articles and chapters that appeared in very obscure places and that basically didn't ever reach much of an audience, and we've kind of got a way to put them together. I've also got a special issue of the Journal for the Study of Esotericism called Correspondences. That actually has to be delivered to the editorial team by June the 15th, so that's one that I'm working on right now. And yeah, there are a few more in the pipeline. Next year, Joseph Aziz is convening a book on John Godolphin Bennett, and I expect to contribute to that as well. Though actually I admit I know much less about Bennett than I should. What I know I feel very strongly is positive and interesting, but I could certainly learn more, and I'm glad he's not going to be asking me to do anything for that project until next year at least.
We've got some time.
I have.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me today. That's been really interesting.
Thank you, Sarah, for your time.
Thank you.